Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about KZ's EDX Pro. So the EDX Pro is a follow-on to last year's, I'll call it a hit. It was a very popular EDX. It came out at $6 or $7 US, and they sold tons of them simply because of that price. And then afterwards, other companies like TRN and CCA released their own 1DDs at budget prices, and that kind of kicked off a whole cascade of tons of very high quality budget sets that came out in 2021. So here we are, almost towards the end of 2021, and KZ decided to update the EDX Pro, or update the EDX with the EDX Pro. So I did buy mine from Luck LZ store. It currently sells for about $13. If you are a subscriber and picked up on the launch day price, it was about $8. So I ended up buying it on launch day for $8. They changed the price the next day to the full $13. But for those of you who got in on the first day, congratulations. So maybe before we get into it, let me talk about, let's kind of jump back to KZ ZSN Pro and Pro X. So when the Pro and Pro X came out, if you read enough reviews of them, you notice that half the people said it's exactly the same. Half the people said, kind of like me, it's a bit brighter than the original. There was a difference in the two. And I didn't really understand at the time. Mine was definitely brighter, and I kind of chalked it up to, maybe mine was just slightly different. I never recommended the Pro X because it always sounded brighter to me. But later when I got my measurement rig and measured the two, they're almost identical. And so it never really made sense. But mine definitely sounded brighter. My Pro X is definitely brighter to me than my Pro is. So fast forward to the EDX and EDX Pro. I tried the Pro, and again, it's a lot brighter than the original EDX. And this time, I kind of measured it again, and let me find the graph. So if we look at the graph real quick, they are super similar. And so you get the EDX Pro, which bumped up the bass a little bit and dropped the treble a little bit. And if you'll recognize this pattern, that is the KZ ZAS pattern. And the rest of it looks pretty much identical. But to me, I am super sensitive to something out here, the same as I was on the Pro X, and it sounds like there's a ton of upper treble air. That's how I would describe it. It's a very fatiguing, very upper treble, too much air kind of noise out there, and it makes the whole set brighter and more fatiguing. So I can almost not listen to the Pro X without using some EQ out here to bring out this whole thing. And I look at the graph, and yeah, I see that they're almost identical, but it's the same exact phenomenon. It sounds way brighter, more fatiguing. It doesn't actually sound. It sort of sounds similar to the original, but not nearly as good to me. So for me, the Pro is kind of a pass because I just can't listen to it. It's way too fatiguing for me, and people who are going to be sensitive to these areas, I would avoid this one as well. But I also noticed that half the people don't notice this at all, so I think it's the same thing with the Pro and the Pro X. I think half the people aren't sensitive to whatever frequency they're bumping out here, and half the people are, and it's very fatiguing and very sibilant, and yeah, it's not a very nice experience. But so that's the short story. I can't get behind the EDX Pro because the EDX sounds a lot better to me. I just can't listen to the Pro X or the EDX Pro at any kind of volume for any length of time. So we'll kind of jump into it really quickly, and we're not going to spend a ton of time on this review simply for that reason. So here's what it looks like. This is the Pro X in green. It's got a translucent shell. For some reason, they decided to throw a QDC connector on this one. If you remember from the original EDX, it actually has a flush 2-pin, and it looks absolutely perfect with this kind of recessed 2-pin. For the EDX Pro, they decided to throw a QDC just to give you something sticking out of your shell for whatever reason. So the stock cable looks like this. It's actually a newer style cable. I think the CCA NRA had something similar in SPC. This is more of a copper version. So I measured it. It's about a 0.7 ohm. It's kind of okay. I used 2.5, so I didn't really use that cable at all. So tips, again, I'll get into tips in a minute or so when we get into it. So as we jump into it, so it graphs like a Blon beater. So the Blon graph, if you remember, looks like this. So all this is almost identical. The Pro has a little more gain, and then the rest of it looks very similar with this kind of triple horn peak. And then out here, it kind of it's very much a very bright, to me, it's a super bright Blon 03 treble. So for me, yeah, no, it's not remotely close to a Blon beater. It's wicked fatiguing and bright. So it graphs like it. Is it? Nope. So it graphs like a ZAS as well, and that is much more closer, and the vocals especially sound very much like a ZAS. And if you caught my ZAS review, you'll remember I didn't like that a whole lot. So this is more the same. I'm just not a fan. It just lost a whole lot of naturalness to the vocals, and it's very much it leans towards the upper range of people's voices, and it's very hard to capture both the upper and the lower. And again, it's just this tinge of brightness that ruins it for me. And so yeah, it's very close to a ZAS, just more fatiguing and less natural for me. So the tips are super important on this one. I tried the original Starline tips, which come in the box. These are the clear version on the green, and you end up with almost no bass. And I know it's just a fit problem, but those actually usually work for me. But if you get an EDX Pro and you don't hear a whole lot of bass, it's because your tips aren't working for you. So these happen to be the KB07, KB07 tips, and I put them on the EDX and the EDX Pro, and they actually work pretty well to bring out all the bass that should be there. So I will say that it's tips are super important. If you're not getting any bass, it's very bright and very sibilant, and even with the right tips, medium volume at most for me, it's that fatiguing that I can't even kind of approach medium volume on the Pro without it getting super annoying. So sound, it does have a big low end, especially when you get the fit right, and it's a bit warmish because of that bleed through. So it is sort of similar to the original, where you've kind of got this bleeding into the mids a bit. It's got a little bit more, and I think it's a little bit more. Listening to the EDX last night, it's not a ton more bass, and maybe vocals are a little thicker, but not. The EDX was actually really good, and I think people forgot how good it was, and so the Pro came out and like, oh, this is really great. The new thing is much better than the old thing, but side by side for me, they are quite different, and the EDX kind of crushes the Pro, mainly because of this whole upper range. So sound, big low end, fit, it's warmish, but it's got this very crisp and edgy. ZAS had the same bit to it. It's kind of an aggressive, crispy edge to it. And the Pro is pushed to the edge of sibilance for me. It's right there. I mean, it's sort of annoying. And so I had to use EQ to get the whole upper range down a bit to the point where I could listen to it. But that's going to be library dependent. If you don't have a whole lot of tracks hitting that area, you probably won't notice, but I kind of noticed right away. So, as I said, the bass measures quite high on this guy. If you look at that graph, it's got, that's BL03 bass. People thought that was bassy. This one is bassy as well. Very high, but still quite controlled. It rarely booms out of place, and it's kind of fast, and it's just below the mids, and it will rumble and slam when you need to it, but not super detailed. It's kind of one note-ish, but it's pretty big, and it's enjoyable and fun. So the Smiths, stop me if you think you've heard this one before. Those drums right in the beginning, really big and deep, and just as they should be. But then when you hear the regular drums in the rest of the track, it definitely sits below the mids, and it's not like crushing the mids in any way. It's very controlled is how I would say it. So the mids, still a bit forward like the EDX. These just sound to me just more lean, brighter, but they still have that clean, clarity, sharp. These are loud. Hard to get small details. As I said, to my ears, you hear a whole lot of the upper range of a voice and not much on the low end. And all the details and texture are very hard to hear for me because of all this other stuff that's in the way. So I will say the lower half of the whole mids is the star, and male vocals that pick up that lower bit like Sam Smith's in another one. You know, that sounds really, really good. And it sounds just like a ZAS. A voice picks up a lot of the low end. It doesn't go out of control. Very nice warmth. It sounds really good. At the upper end, it's too hard to listen to for me. So the treble, you'll probably think it's either more extended than a BL03 if you don't hear any of the upper treble, or there's way too much air, and it's going to get very fatiguing if you don't address it with EQ. So Joy Division's Love Will Tear Us Apart, this 2020 remaster version, there's just so much upper range air around the snares, and the whole thing, it's basically sitting kind of at the top of your head. And the last set that did this was the Prisma Azul, had the same exact thing. You get all this noise up in the upper range, and it starts ringing your ears, and it gets very fatiguing. And so that song on this set does exactly what Azul does. And those snares and the synth, all that stuff starts to overtake the vocals. And if you EQ it, it really brings it back in line, and the vocals are more in focus again. And that also, for me, gives the vocals more body and weight. It gets rid of all this high-frequency noise that's distracting me and fatiguing me. So the stage is pretty average. It's actually got a pretty good width and separation. It's got KZ visor height. If you're staring straight ahead, some sets the vocal is straight right in front of you. KZ lifts those to where about your baseball hat or visor would be. It's kind of, there's a little height there, and it's actually pretty effective on most KZs. And the ZAX actually does the same thing. The ZAS is probably the same exact thing. So the EDX Pro sounds a bit wider than the EDX, and again, people may not hear the higher frequencies, but when they say it's wider, a lot of that is coming from all this energy that's out in the upper range. So yeah, that part actually improved. That's probably the best part of the Pro for me, is the stage is actually a little bit better, but the cost to it is a super fatiguing set that I can't listen to, so it doesn't really do me any good. So that's about it. That is my take on the EDX Pro. Good luck to you folks. Half of you probably will think it's great, and half of you will find it super fatiguing. So if you want to take that chance, it's a nice set at an affordable price. So thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time.